Let me bring you my guests. I am joined with the one and only Warwick Powell. Warwick, I'm sorry for the delay. I had to actually switch computers, and so I'm hoping that this computer holds up okay over the course of this interview. How are you doing today? You doing okay this evening?
Yeah, not too bad. I'm glad that you've solved your technology problems. It's there's nothing more frustrating.
It's not soft. The computer is like literally sitting right here. I'm hoping that I'm hoping it resolves. But thank you for joining me. I always appreciate you joining me. Just for the audience, just so they know who you are. Warwick Powell, he is an adjunct professor, Queensland University of Technology, chairman of Smart Trade Networks Group of Companies, president of Data Integrity and Supply Chains Association, Inc. Thank you for joining me, man. You wrote an article, and let me pull it up on this computer because the other one actually went down. I had to restart everything. But in essence, what you were making this argument was that people were making this argument that China was effectively a mercantile economy, that they were putting out more products than they were actually taking in. And the point of your article was to, as you typically do, go through numbers in order to show that these people, they're complaining about their own failings. Basically, it seems that they're bothered more so by their incapacity to compete as opposed to this idea that China is exporting but not importing products. What's going on with this? Because you note a few people who are making this argument.
Yeah, look, this has been doing the rounds again, and has been for a while. You know, this idea that that China is exporting the world to death, and the kind of stories that are told is that Chinese manufacturers are, represent so many percent of global outputs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the problem with this kind of story is that I think it fails to understand what's going on with trade to start with. And that is that trade is a dynamic process that really is a consequence of an evolving distribution of productive capacity. Right. So the obsession about trade per se, in a sense, forgets that the first thing we should actually be much more interested in is the structure of production within an economic system. The second thing about these arguments is that they present a very narrow view of what constitutes trade, or at least the trade numbers that matter. In essence, it is entirely obsessed with trade in manufactured goods, and there is no doubt that China is the global leader in manufacturing, to a point where an American economist, Richard Baldwin, beginning of last year, actually wrote a piece that described China as the only manufacturing superpower in the world. So there's no doubt that Chinese manufacturing is a major part of the global economic scene. Chinese manufacturing basically produces things in every category of goods. Right? It's the only economy in the world that actually manufactures things in every conceivable category. Okay, so now that we've gotten that bit out of the way, we can then look at the bigger picture, and that is that China is also one of the biggest importers of things, and it imports agricultural products. So it's a net importer of foods. It's a major importer of energy, whether it's coal, oil, and gas. It is, of course, a major importer of services by way of education services, tourism services, software, movies, computer games, and so it is. And China is also a major importer, of course, of mineral products, raw materials. So the balance really isn't that significantly out of whack. The most important figure, firstly, to understand is that in terms of net exports, which is exports minus imports, net exports contributes less than 3% of China's GDP. So it imports stuff, it exports stuff. When you net them out together, what's left makes a very, very small contribution to China's overall economy. It's a less than 3% contribution, and it has been less than 3% now for the best part of the last decade. About 15, 18 years or so ago, it peaked at a much higher level where net exports was in the order of about 6 or 7% from memory of China's GDP, but it has been tapering off ever since. So Chinese imports have also been significant, all right?
Mhm.
And now, one of the claims is that China's import growth has plateaued. And that claim has been made on value terms. So in dollar value terms, over the last few years, Chinese imports have not really grown very much. And that's true. But in volume terms, when you want to measure it by tons and kilograms and units of things, across all of the major categories of imports, Chinese imports have actually grown. China imports also, by the way, aeroplanes, civil aviation, and semiconductors. Right, so it continues to import a huge number of semiconductors, massive volume terms. So in a whole bunch of areas, Chinese firms, of course, continue to import lots of things. Now, what's important to understand about all of this is that Chinese exports have really experienced a very significant and rapid rise in a small number of categories, namely EVs, solar photovoltaics, and batteries. They're your big ones, as well as in the last couple of years, China's own semiconductors, right? So China is now exporting semiconductors in numbers that it certainly didn't do a few years ago. So the big growth in Chinese manufactured exports has been concentrated in a very, very small number of product categories. If you took those out of the equation, Chinese manufactured trade, balanced off against its imports of other things, is roughly on a par. So the bit that's really causing the anxiety, if you will, is actually these leading edge tech areas: EVs, batteries, solar PVs, and to some extent semiconductors. The other thing to bear in mind is that Chinese imports and exports are heavily related as well, not just as offsets, but in fact as a result of integrated supply chains. So many of the manufactures that Chinese companies make and sell, both domestically and into the overseas market, are possible because of the raw materials that are imported from all around the world. So the extent to which there is growth in volume in Chinese exports is also the driver of the growth in volume of Chinese imports of a whole bunch of these raw materials. So they're connected to each other. And so if people want to sort of run an argument that says, oh, China should reduce its exports but increase its imports, it actually doesn't make sense because of how integrated these supply chains are. And so the usual policy response, and this is the last little piece that I present in that article, is there's a line that basically says the RMB is undervalued; it should be revalued at least 10%. And the Financial Times actually had a piece earlier this week, or late last week, that talked about how China's RMB should revalue over the next 5 years by at least 50%. And the theory behind this, is to make Chinese exports more expensive and to enable China to import more. The problem with this theory is that it assumes that all of the costs of China's exports are determined domestically. But in many of the things that China exports, particularly the things that I talked about, those high growth areas, the majority of the costs that go into those things is actually from imported inputs, which means that if you increase the value of the RMB, you're making it cheaper for those products to be manufactured. And it actually means that there's every likelihood that those products will actually be cheaper to the end consumer than they are today. So you've always got to be a little bit careful about what you wish for. You've really got to understand that in today's world where supply chains are integrated and where Chinese manufacturing is really one node of complex processes that involve imports and exports of raw materials and intermediate goods, that fluctuations in currency relative values may not necessarily deliver the textbook results that many people want. So, so basically, I say, Jamal, that the charge of mercantilism is somewhat misplaced. It's
Yeah.
premised on a very narrow view as to what part of the trade equation matters. It really only talks about manufacturers. It ignores the fact that China remains a huge importer of all sorts of things. And it also ignores the fact that in volume terms, not in dollar terms, but in raw volume terms, China is importing continuing compound annual growth rate for the last 10 years of most of these things is over 3%. So, it's not insignificant. And I think people are a little bit, well, and maybe not intentionally, but certainly somewhat misleading when they get narrowly focused on one sector at the expense of what else is going on in other parts of the economic system.
I would say some of these people are intentional. Maybe that's me being cynical. Scott Bensent, for example, when he was making this argument that he just wants to help China, he wants to help them rejigger their economy where they can import more products because apparently our ability to compete has been undermined by China's, let's say, success in this. And this is, on some level, how China has made themselves a success, correct? This notion of exports, this idea that they can increase the amount
to
of...
an extent, but nowhere near as much as people say, right? So Chinese manufacturing basically exports about 20% of output, and that's declined over the years as well. It's sort of tapered at the moment. It's sort of plateaued at around 20% of output, bearing in mind that output's growing as well. So the domestic market's absorbing a greater volume of manufactured outputs, and roughly at about 80%. In some sectors, it's actually domestic market actually absorbs close to 90% of all things made. And I speak in particular about EVs. I'd say EV production volumes have been growing tremendously, but the overwhelming majority of EVs that come off the production lines of Chinese factories are actually sold to Chinese buyers. So I guess one of the challenges for people is that China's a big place. It's 1.4 billion people. It's what's that? An eighth of the world's population. Its GDP is arguably 1/5 of the global GDP, if not even bigger. So it's large, but in proportionate terms, almost all of its economic activities are geared towards the domestic market, and I don't think China goes out of its way to be particularly mercantilist. So the idea of mercantilism is a conscious strategy to maximize exports, minimize imports. And China doesn't really do that. If it did, it wouldn't be importing the kinds of things that it currently imports. It imports these things, by the way, because for a lot of them, it needs to import them, whether it's for food security, whether it's for raw materials that are needed for other parts of the production system, and whether it's for discretionary expenditure, tourism and those sorts of things. Right? So China will continue to be an important market for products from all around the world. The fact that it's opened up its markets to over 50 African states in terms of zero tariffs is an example of that. It does need to enable the parts of the world that produce things to have access to the China market. And the Chinese government, I think, is more than happy for Chinese consumers to have access to all sorts of diverse things from around the world as well.
And by the way, I'm not saying part of China's success of being able to be an exporter is a negative. I mean, they've been able to draw 800 million people, a million people out of poverty. And part of that is people in factories, people incomes are going up, etc. But that doesn't mean that they're also not importing. So I don't want to make the argument that they're doing this without also importing products. That's not the argument that I'm making. I guess I'm trying to show a disparity between the US, which is a consumer country, versus China, which has the ability to do imports and exports. I mean, for God's sake, their industrial capacity is astonishing. How does this...
this goes back to that earlier comment that I made, which is that a lot of people who talk about these issues get really obsessed by trade. What they really should be looking at is the changing evolution of the production systems. Right? So if you looked at the composition of the American economy 50 years ago, it looked very different back then to what it does today. And as a consequence of transformations in the structure of production, it continues to meet the needs of its population. Companies are importing things that are made elsewhere. In fact, many of these companies relocated their production activities away from North America and then imported the production back to service the American consumer. So, these are the dynamics that have taken place over the years. China does have a very strong sense from a public policy point of view that economic systems are principally production systems, and it's production that drives the rest of the sort of circulation and the satisfaction of needs. And therefore, you've got to always focus on what's happening in your production part of an economy. Now, that's not to say that they sit on their laurels and go, well, we've sorted that. In fact, quite the reverse. What it does is that it's constantly driven by the idea that production needs to be made more efficient from an energetic point of view, time, and other factors of production. It is driven by the idea that intense competition, particularly in your more downstream sectors, is critical to ensuring that consumers in society get access to the best things at the best price. It also has a view that innovation is necessary, particularly upstream, for processes and technologies that will have an impact across an economy. So we've seen ongoing investments in scientific work around processing different metals, for example, or a whole lot of work in scientific labs around the material sciences. How do we make better use of materials to improve electrical conductivity, or to make stronger but lighter things, or what have you? There's a lot of investment in telecommunications technologies, both in a hardware sense, but also in a software sense, because there's an understanding that that's a bit of kit, if you will, that affects the whole show. And so there's a lot of commitment, at the innovation and research and development level upstream. And, these things are constantly in flux. China is a developmental state that has a very, I think, a colleague of mine in Brazil actually talks a lot more about this through the lens of very well-known political economist Schumpeter, who gave rise to the phrase creative destruction, right? And my colleague in Brazil will talk about China really as a Shumpeterian creative destruction kind of state, right? And that's a way of thinking about China's development. It certainly doesn't sit still. Competition's intense, massive commitments of public resources, financially and otherwise, to innovation. Infrastructure, of course, as everybody knows, is really in many parts of the country second to none now, and continuing to roll out. But all of that is in the name of enabling the production of what is in effect relative abundance. And once you've got relative abundance in the production system, you need to ensure that there is intense competition in the circulation or distribution networks to ensure that those goods get to people in the quickest and cheapest possible ways. And that, in some ways, is the sort of China story. The fact that there are exports is in some parts a byproduct of the capacity that it's built. And in the early days, so in the 80s and 90s, where there was more commitment to exports, a lot of that was to earn foreign reserves. But the other thing to remember about the exports, particularly in that time, is that the manufactured exports were largely undertaken by foreign firms that had set up factories in China. Okay, so it wasn't Chinese firms. Chinese firms exporting only overtook foreign firms that had set up factories in China and exported from China in the mid-2010s in terms of the value of their exports. So until about 8 or 9 years ago, most of the exports from China was actually undertaken by foreign-owned firms.
How do you compare this with America's economy? I mean, at some point we switched over to a consumer economy, and
Look,
this
yeah, consumer, services, and financial sector, right?
financialization, right, as opposed to industry.
Financialization. Yeah. So financialization was really the emergence of an industry which manufactured financial products, you know, things that you could invest in that would deliver you a monetary return. But they weren't necessarily things that made anything. Okay, so that's financialization, things that you could trade, stocks, derivatives, bonds, options and what have you. So that's a big part of the contemporary American economy. The sort of explosion of finance is actually a driver of monetary wealth creation. Services, of course, has been the other big part. So finance, of course, is often seen as part of the services economy, but other parts of the services economy have grown as well. And we know from a straight GDP accounting point of view, services like healthcare have really ballooned, representing about 16% of US GDP. Now that's remarkable because the global average is about 9.5, 10%. So the healthcare sector in the US has really ballooned in terms of its relative financial value. That's not to say it delivers value for money. Okay. In fact, it's well known to be one of the most expensive healthcare sectors in the world, but it does dominate a large part of the American economy these days. Private education is another classic case in point. Incredibly expensive in financial accounting terms, but it's basically an education, right? So the American economy has tilted very much towards the services sector. It has seen a hollowing out over the last 40 years of what I would call the mundane elements of domestic industry. The things that people would have and I guess continue to have a day-to-day experience with, whether it's clothes or the furniture that we have in our homes or the tools that we use, around our homes, the crockery, the linen, and all the things that make up our daily lives. Increasingly, those things are not made in the United States. And they're certainly not made in factories that are close to where people live. And in some respects, if you think back 50, 60 years, many of the things that people had in their homes were made in factories, at least within their state. Right? That just doesn't happen anymore. So financialization, a hollowing out of those sort of everyday manufacturing, I guess, is the other part. But I think that there's one more feature that's worth touching upon, and that is that ever since the early 2000s, we've seen the financialization of households as well. So we've seen an evolution of the structure of a household's income and expenditure and its assets and liabilities in a way that has seen American households become increasingly indebted, right? And this was the idea that earned income, the single wage or the two wages, was insufficient for the quality of life that an American should have and aspire to, but that could be solved through the provision of private credit. And so American households from the early 2000s onwards began to have marketed to them a whole range of financial products. Of course, credit cards, we know, but loans for cars, loans for home improvements,
The
loans for
house.
holidays,
Yep.
loans for, well, just about anything and everything, right? And
Wedding
of
rings.
course,
Yeah.
yeah, and now we have buy now pay later schemes, which is a more recent variation of all of this. But American households have actually become increasingly indebted, and these three features, I guess, of the American political economy contrast very significantly with the structure of the Chinese political economy.
China, like renting houses, I mean, you can even go into medical debt, right? Like medical debt is another one where you have to pay over a period of time for a hospital visit or hospital stay. I mean, God, man, there's so many of these things that you can't necessarily pay for all in one go. How does China deal with this? And this can be the last question because I don't want to keep you late.
That's all right. Look, healthcare in China is principally delivered through the public sector. And there is a small but emerging private health part of the Chinese healthcare system, but the dominant part of the healthcare system is public provision. It's also heavily geared towards hospitals. So hospitals have been a traditional feature of how healthcare gets delivered, which means that, so rather than having local doctors, spread through suburban practices, China has big hospitals in their cities and towns, and whenever people get sick, instead of going to see your local doctor, they actually end up going to the hospital. Right, so the service delivery model has historically been a little bit different. One of the challenges of that model is that it has heavily focused on how does it resource the supply side. So during the course of the last 15 or 16 years, the efforts have gone into either trying to get more nurses, trying to hire more doctors, trying to build more buildings and those sorts of things, particularly big hospitals. So how do we make the hospitals bigger? How do we enable the hospitals to handle more patients? There's one of the big hospitals in Shanghai, for example, receives 10,000 presentations a day at the emergency, right? Now, that a lot of those, by the way, are people who come from out of town. They want to see a doctor, and they think the doctor in town, in the big city, is a better doctor than the one from the smaller town. But they also will go there because they've got a cold, right? They've got a common cold, common flu, because there hasn't been a structure of medical delivery that involves a network of general practitioners. I think that model is going to evolve, and in part it will evolve because of the development of technologies. So diagnostic technologies, sensing data, where you can have data, devices that track your health status. All of this stuff is going to enable a more targeted, distributed system of triage. So instead of somebody getting a sniffle in their nose running off to the hospital, the aim will be that when they get a sniffle on the nose, that they will in effect self-diagnose or be diagnosed by data, fever, heart rates, body temperature, etc., etc. And it's those sorts of systems that I think will evolve to better manage demand, actually, right? Health is a very interesting area because doesn't matter how expensive it is, people will, use it because it involves life and death, right?
Yeah.
So the real aim is to manage demand, to reduce pressure on the system at large, and ensure that people who are genuinely sick with particular kinds of ailments are able to gain the attention that they need in a timely way, instead of having the queue, in a sense, clogged up by people who don't need to be in the queue.
Yeah. What about homes? I mean, because as you pointed out, America's credit cards, healthcare bills, home bills, cars, cell phones, like you can go down the list of things that people effectively these financialized products, but you can't necessarily get away from. How does China do that? Like, do they do this in a different way to cut expenses where these aren't necessarily liabilities that their people, citizens, are stuck with? Or
look, there have been some experiments in the last 10 years with retirement village models that came from the United States and even from Australia. I don't think they've been entirely successful, and there will need to be, I think, more reforms around the delivery of social services for the graying population. And I'm not, so a lot of people historically, of course, in Chinese family environments, grow old at home, and they're looked after by their children and their grandchildren. That's not as easy these days because more and more younger people no longer live near their parents, and they have moved to a bigger city for work or what have you. And there is, I think, quite a lot of social and economic disruption that's taken place because of these changing patterns of work and separating families from hometowns, where new models of aged care in particular is going to become necessary. And that is going to create, by the way, new industries, right? At home care is going to become actually a really important industry going forward in China's own services sector, combined with robotics and sensors. And I think that they're the kinds of things that the Chinese state at large, and also different provincial and city governments, are looking at to deliver healthcare and aged care in reasonably affordable ways.
Wait, you said robotics. Oh,
Yeah.
so you're thinking like these human-shaped robots
Yeah.
delivering? Really?
Oh, not just delivering things, but actually being in-home help.
Yeah, I know.
Uh,
That's what I'm saying. Like
yeah. Yeah.
that's mind blowing on some level. Like that's very futuristic. Because I've
Yeah.
seen them. I mean, the software apparently is not necessarily up to date in order to kind of do that stuff yet. But you're foreseeing this kind of artificial general intelligence where
Yeah.
these things are able to
I've got
pretend to
here.
be human beings.
I mean, I'm not going to flog a particular product, but this is an ear set, and it's with some colleagues of mine who've been working on this technology,
Uh,
and it's very clever in the sense that it's built into your ear set, and it emits LED light, and it gets the reflection back from inside your ear where there's lots of blood vessels and stuff, and then it takes that data and then through its algorithms delivers outputs on your body temperature, blood pressure, blood oxygen, and a couple of other key metrics. Now, that was originally developed, and the reason why I brought it up, one, it was just sitting on my desk, but is that it was developed by somebody who wanted more effective, non-invasive, real-time monitoring of old people, such as his parents, where you could have very early warnings of somebody who may, in the next, hour, have an episode. So this really starts to give you very whether they would fall, but it was also to be able to detect that they'd fallen, all those sorts of things. So these are things that people are concerned about, and they're using technology as a way of intervening. They're also using technology as a way of ensuring that people receive the right scripts of medication and that they take the medication. So that's always been a bit of a challenge, is making sure that an older person takes the right things, right? And, we all know the little boxes with Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and all that sort of stuff
that's
on
too
them.
big brothers for me. I hate
Yeah.
that.
Right.
It's like that's one of the things I hate, actually, because it's like there's some drug companies that are saying, yeah, we're creating products to ensure that people forcibly take the products. Okay, what if the person doesn't want to take the product? Like they go to the doctor and they blow the doctor off. I think the doctor's full of it.
And look, of course, there's also a lot of Chinese medicine re-emerging too, and the sort of integration. So, biotechnology is one of the fastest growing areas in China now. Biotechnology, biopharmaceuticals. In fact, it's understood to be, a lot of focus has gone into China's work in AI, what it's done in engineering, what it's done in battery technologies, and all these other things. But the big frontier now, where Chinese research and development has really taken the global lead, is in biopharmaceuticals. And so we are going to see, and that's largely driven by low costs of production for making stuff, chemistry and things like that. But also the fact that China has a critical mass of medical researchers and bio researchers and people who, really diverse, right? So people who are doing, genetic analytics all the way through to people who have incredible knowledge in botanicals, right? Herbs and that sort of stuff, and actually really understanding the chemical properties of these botanicals. Through traditional Chinese medicine, there was a view that X, Y, and Z would be useful for whatever. But now they're really getting into trying to figure out what the causal connections are. and why it is that certain herbs or roots or what have you do have these beneficial effects on particular ailments. And I think we're going to start to see incredible developments in these frontiers as well.
I would tell you, the robot thing concerns me a little bit. Like, there was always this belief that regardless of the jobs that are lost, like across the board, whether it's in diagnostics, whether it's in software, comp sci, whatever, that you can never replace the person. Like, meaning a human touch dealing with a person that's, let's say, elderly or child or something to that effect is on some level irreplaceable. That may not be the case, though. I've seen these robots that are coming out from China. And yeah, they look a little weird now, but what does it look like in 20 years? And what does it look like when you get software that can, let's say, perform various duties that a person may not necessarily want to do, or at the very least is capable enough to function in those places where they don't have a child, where they don't have the capability of paying for, let's say, a nurse or something like that. You can kind of see it. I mean, even now, in the way that the robotics have evolved over the course of time and the dexterity of those robots, it's amazing. It's very amazing.
Yeah, look, I think that there are good reasons to, I guess, tread warily into this space. Not only in a physiological sense, it's quite amazing where the developments are going in terms of the dexterity and all of that. But I think the real frontier is going to be in the area of how do these robots successfully emulate human interactions, right? And that's the empathy issues and the context and all of that. And and for the time being, anyway, I think we're still, as humans, reasonably safe ground. AI still has a long way to go before it can do all of that. And if you're dealing with children or old people, I think there is something about the empathy that people can actually have and sense, and only have that through the sort of development of a relationship that you have with somebody that you spend time with over time. And but no doubt people working in the AI space will be exploring how they can, at the very least, emulate that so that it appears that the robot is empathetic and all those things, even if, of course, they aren't.
Please let me get one more question in. And extrapolate for me on this very specific point. Whether it's with AI doing various jobs, I mean, even large language models have gotten to the point where they're dumb, but kind of not. Like, it just kind of depends on what you ask it, right? And even like with YouTube videos, like when you would like titles, descriptions, like all of this grunt work that you don't necessarily want to do, where you can analyze a video and then spit out a description. Okay, well, it saves a huge amount of time. And that's not just with this, that's with the web service. Like, for example, in CompSci, my old company, when the first company that I worked with as a software engineer, I remember they used to say, well, we used to make like $1 million off of a contract. And over the course of, let's say, 5 years, that number went down to like 100,000, because for the most part, there were so many tools and so much of the work that just became, let's say, grunt work that was automated, that you didn't need to spend that much money anymore. In which case, the amount of money that the company made went down as a direct result of the tools that were being built. This was before AI has even became a thing. And I know for myself, at the company that I used to work at, the auto company, I built systems that eliminated jobs. Like, it's just stuff that software could do better than human beings, that they had human beings doing, where they had to move people over to somewhere else because they didn't need them to do that task. That was basic. And so, like, you can look and say, okay, well, what does this look like in 10 years? When truck drivers no longer need jobs, when Uber is automated, when Android or robots bring things to your house, so you don't necessarily need an Uber driver to bring things to your house. These are classes of jobs that are just going to evaporate. I don't know how America is going to deal with this, because we don't necessarily have a system that is in place to even contemplate this issue. From my point of view, if you're not working, you're lazy bum, you deserve to down the street without healthcare. How does China deal with this? Because they're also going to run into this, especially since a lot of what they're using AI for is not military in the way that the US is using it. It's for infrastructure and those type of things. Like, it's how do we make our products faster, cheaper? How do we use less energy? How do we use less human capital, etc.? How are they going to deal with this issue? Because they're going to run into it, I would argue, faster than we are.
Well, in many ways, of course, the issues are no different, because things that human beings used to do won't be things that humans will do. Now, this, of course, has been a recurring theme of human history, particularly in the post-industrial period, right? So since industrialization 300 or so years ago, we've constantly been going through episodes of job replacement as new technologies come in. But at the same time, we also know that that causes new things to emerge. If there's one thing humans are particularly good at as we solve problems using things like technologies, is that in the act of solving one problem, we usually create at least two new ones and maybe three or four others that we don't even know about. And in that sense, we will continue to create work for ourselves. The sort of driver of humans, humanity as creative beings, I think, does leave a space open for the ongoing need for humans. But I also reflect a little bit on some of the discussions in the 1920s when there was optimistic talk that mechanization, before automation, big factories, would lead to abundance and would ultimately enable people to have a lot more leisure time. Right? So I don't have to work 5 days a week. Society only needs people to work 2 days a week, and we'll have a lot more time to pursue all sorts of other pursuits, leisure and hobbies and other things that are meaningful to us. That's an optimistic view of that. And I think whether or not we have an optimistic end outcome or a more dystopian end outcome is going to come down to how states and governments, as expressions of the expectations and hopes of the people, ultimately govern the distribution of the surpluses that emerge. Right. So, if you've got a robot that can do the work of 10 people, we literally have a whole lot of surplus now. So the question is who gets it? What does that surplus do? How does that contribute to social well-being? Or is it a surplus that's accumulated by, one person, and 9 people can sort of, forget about it? And that does come down to how societies organize themselves. China does have a much stronger ethos around this sense of public goods, and the idea of state-owned enterprises being important parts of the economic system, I think, will help China deal with some of these issues easier in some respects, because it knows that it's got a history of not letting people fall through the cracks too far. I think the challenge for North America is, of course, it does have a cultural outlook that says, well, if you're unemployed, it's your fault, right? And if there's lots of you, too bad. And that's going to become, I think, a political and social challenge, which really just amplifies the problems that, we've touched on not only earlier today, but also in our previous discussions as well.
Yeah. Warwick, thank you for this. Thank you for letting me be in your ear. I'm always learn something in these conversations, and hopefully the audience does also. I really appreciate it. And your articles are fantastic, just so the audience can see the latest. There's a lot of dogs here, unfortunately. I will be leaving here soon.
We let the dogs out.
Yeah. Unfortunately, they always let the dogs out, and they're often unkept and just kind of roam the place. It's wild, right? You go from one location that is that believes dogs are dirty, but for religious reasons, and so you never see dogs. You only see cats, and you see the random cat that's taken care of that is like lounging near the laundromat. And then you come to a country where it's the opposite. I've seen no cats in Nepal. You've seen dogs everywhere. It's so weird. It's just such a culture shift. But this is the article that you came up with, McCarthy 2.0, China's economic structure, trade patterns, Western mercantilist simulacra. Definitely check his Substack out.
Cool.
You have fantastic articles on your Substack page. And so the audience will know who you are if they don't at this point. Dr. Warwick Powell, he's adjunct professor, Queensland University of Technology, chairman of Smart Trade Networks Group of Companies, and president of Data Integrity and Supply Chain Association, Inc. Dr. Powell, thank you for this, man. You be safe, okay?
You too. Have a great one.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.